I'm not sure if you're I'm not sure how much you're on like social media, especially Twitter. Um, but there's obviously a ton of activity and whatever going on there. Lots of different documentation, and
Hmm.
one of the things that took place was in Portland, Oregon. There was an activist group that went by the name Riot Ribs, and essentially what it was is that I don't know if it was in downtown Portland or some other area. They basically established, I guess like you say, just like a public potluck or whatever, right? So
Hmm.
different people are cooking and preparing different foods and whatnot, and just giving it, serving up plates, saying to whoever's coming and getting it and whatnot, right?
Hmm.
And I'm not sure about if there were any disputes about if they needed if they needed permission, if they needed to get a license to do that and whatnot. Overall, I see that as a positive thing. But unfortunately, the reaction to it was extremely negative. Portland is a city with a lot of political strife between left wing and right winger, or I
Hmm.
should say far left and far right
Yeah.
factions and whatnot. And being as this group activity was seen as being associated with left wingers, the far right will come through and ransack the shit and attack people and whatnot. Not saying that they were necessarily ones that always provoked it, but this thing that could have benefited anybody of any background that just come up and gets food, I think
Hmm.
ultimately did a disservice overall. And then you also had incidents where the police would come through and not just shut down the food being made, but that they would pepper, like you've seen footage of them pepper spraying the food, making it inedible. So
Yeah.
this really just sociopathic and just destructive, and just showing that they really are against people getting the basics of necessity, needs that they have to just
Yeah.
in life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you touched on a really good point, and that kind of ties into this idea that I've been working on about how food is kind of like the whole point of this podcast is that to kind of get the idea across that food should not be politicized. That food is if we can't agree on food, we can't agree on anything basically, because like food is like the one thing that we should be able to agree on because we all need it. And the amount of politicization that has gone into our food has just proven that we really can't be on the same grounds for anything for any particular reason. So it's kind of to your point, it's interesting to see that different political groups can't even agree on how food should be distributed, if food should be distributed in certain ways. And a lot of that might not have anything to do with the food itself. It might just be, because those groups just don't like to see each other do anything semi-productive. And, like, so it's difficult to say that, one side just doesn't want people to have free food, and it might just be one side doesn't want the other person to be giving away free food. And so it's like, it's hard to say where the line is on exactly the reasoning behind those actions. No matter what, they're wrong. No matter what, those things should be prevented, and we should have better ways of going about having those interactions. With the like it's like the community potluck kind of stuff. Although that does make me think of the like back when they were having the I can't remember what it was called, the micro city inside Washington.
Oh, Jazz, the autonomous zone.
Yes, yes. How like the first few days they had like a massive like stack of food for people to just take wherever whenever they needed it, and then homeless people came over and just took all of it at once, and like nobody had any food for like the entire time. Like that kind of stuff is usually the example I cite to whenever we go about talking about community food sources, because in theory that they're a good idea, but that they can have flaws. And so I think that in citing both of those instances, you can show that we need to have a better conversation about how to handle our food and how to distribute it properly. I think at the end of the day, it all goes back to infrastructure. Like if you have proper infrastructure to handle these kinds of things, then it makes it difficult for groups, whether they be homeless people or political activists or police, whoever it is. If you have proper infrastructure to have effective distribution, then it makes it more difficult to shut those kinds of things down. And so I think that a lot of what goes into making those kinds of events successful is just planning infrastructure, having some kind of support from local like community members that can actually benefit from like maybe getting like the city council on board with it, or getting like your mayor on board with it, which I know is a difficult thing to do, but like having that kind of support can make it easier to get that kind of stuff done. So um, that's not to say that those people were in the wrong for trying to do something without permission, basically. But like I think that we're not in a we're not in a good place to go about having those kinds of interactions happen until we figure out a better way to have the conversation about whether or not they should happen and how we should go about doing them if we are going to do them at all. So I don't know. It's kind of a difficult, that's a difficult place to go because, like I said, food is just, it's such a useful and important thing to have. It's just like anytime we talk about it, it's like, well, we should be all on board for this, but it's like every time we talk about it, we end up getting on the wrong page for things. So I I don't really know what the right answer is to how we should about talking about this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's, I tend not to think that there's one final, answer because, like you said, while I agree that, infrastructure is obviously a key component, we also acknowledge that, the literacy and the cultural, leanings, or I guess you could say the beliefs and whatnot, are important as well. Because you could have the infrastructure there, but if you have a bunch of people operating within or outside of it who don't share those same inclinations, then the infrastructure can, also fall apart or just, lose its integrity. And that's, plenty of, we see that as well. And one thing that I will say is that one of the critiques that I have of my peers on the left, especially those who call themselves anarchists, is they shun hierarchy and infrastructure to the detriment of the movement. Because as you said, you have this thing. It sounds nice, but when you just say, "Oh, we have a pallet of food," and you're just like, and because what the assumption is, oh, everybody's going to be reasonable and considerate of those around them. You're not thinking about the fact that if you've been starving and you've been on the streets or something like that, you have that I forget the exact term, but you have a starvation mindset or whatever. You're like, oh, I may not be able to get food for tomorrow, so naturally you're going to go and get saying 3 or 4 saying worth of supplies when you only got 1 or 2. And that's where being too lax in terms of establishing hierarchies and embracing infrastructure, so that's there's it's a multifaceted issue and there's no one singular answer. It's more like we have to hit different angles from internally as well as externally, because they have to be it has to be like a circuit. They have to be reinforcing one another and feeding off one another.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, and that's solid point. And I think that you definitely have hit the nail right on the head. And there's like you said, there's just a lot of different moving pieces that need to be accounted for whenever we're going about doing these kinds of things. And I also think it's interesting to talk about the difference in place that we when we talk about food, we talk about very different sides of the food chain. So like typically when we talk about world hunger or like homeless people not having access to food or low income families not having access to food or food waste or any of that kind of stuff, typically we think of food as its final product. We tend to not think about food on the production side of things, where really that might be where we're missing the mark a little bit. And that's not just because I'm an agriculturalist, but there's a lot of small scale farmers that really enjoy helping the community and have no problem getting food to people who need it. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about like like we mentioned with the literacy thing and having a conversation about the food itself and what it goes through to get to where it is. There's a lot to be said about how the food is grown too. Like that literacy can't just take place in what is on the shelf, but also how to get to the shelf. Literacy has to start with at what point was it put in the ground, what happened to it while it was in the ground, and then what happened to it every step of the way until it got to your plate. And so that's, I think, part of the reason why a lot of these things are kind of getting misconstrued is because people aren't thinking of food as what food is. They're thinking of it more as almost like a symbol of value or a symbol of wealth, and that kind of creates some false or not necessarily false, but it creates like tension between different groups because they see food as a power symbol when really like food is like I've been saying the whole time, food should be a unifying thing, not a dividing thing. And so like, I think that what I try to do on this podcast all the time is just try to bring more attention to the agricultural side of things. I think that having more conversations about where the food comes from and what goes into it and what the farmers do for it and all that kind of stuff could be beneficial to not just the people who are consuming the food, but the people who are trying to distribute that food too. Because like I mentioned, I actually know quite a few local farmers. So right now I'm living in Fresno. I'm a little bit about an hour north of where I usually like where I'm from. We do have an In-N-Out here. We have an In-N-Out in Visalia too, which is right next to my hometown. But we have local farmers that are small scale farmers, and they are I can't remember what exactly the term is, but basically they run their operation where they like, let's just say, actually I know one it's a hog operation So they have their hogs, they have like all of their swine or whatever. They don't butcher them and send them off to be packaged and off to the store. They butcher them all in their same operation and they sell them at their doorstep. So people can come in and they can actually pick a pig. And actually that's what their website is called, Pick a Pig, and they can go through the entire like operation, see what they do, see how the whole slaughter process works, see how clean it is, all the processes they go through, and then they get to buy the meat at the end of the day. So like having that level of interaction with the farmer is also it's cheaper, it's safer because you know exactly where it's coming from and what went into it, and not only that, it can be a much more beneficial from a community level, a much more beneficial source of food for everyone involved. So like that, I actually know that those people sell to lower income families, certain because those lower income families can't afford it in the store, so they go to the local farmer. Local farmer can get them their healthy source of meat and vegetables and stuff like that for a lower price. So like having more community involvement with agriculturalists can be very beneficial to to this exact issue that we're talking about.